Subscribe now and press the bell icon. Never miss an update.
So when you're talking about building for Bharat, building for your countrymen, what you're really talking about is building for the middle of our Indian income pyramid. These are people that earn between 2 and 10 lakh rupees per year. And there are over 50 crore Indians that live like that. And when you think about it, that's not an awful lot of money. Even at the top of that income bracket, we're talking about 10 lakh rupees split between 5 people, which means each person gets roughly about 2 lakh rupees on average to go by for the entire year. That particular category, that's middle class. You and I have that level of income. We are sole income earners. We don't have too many dependents. This target audience is probably young, probably aspiring to build something for themselves and for the country. So let's dig a little deeper and see what it takes to build for this, to build for Bharat. Before we go into what it takes to build for Bharat, we must take a moment to acknowledge what Bharat really is, what its demographics are like, what our country actually is. Some things that we take for granted very, very often. The first of which is the fact that we are a poor country. It's something that we don't acknowledge anymore. Often, if you're looking at this video, you probably think of yourself as middle class. I did too, and so do most people that I know who sit in an AC office, work on a laptop. If you have a laptop at home, I can tell you most definitely, you're probably not middle class. Certainly if you had one in your home 5 years ago. To get a sense of how diverse and poor we really are, here are a few numbers. We all know that we're 1.3 billion people, but at the same time, we speak 786 languages. 29 of those languages are spoken by more than 1 million people. 22 of them are recognized as official languages in our constitution. We have 86 different scripts. Linguistically speaking, other than the island nation of Papua New Guinea, there's no other country on earth that even comes close. We are therefore not just one country, we are many countries. So building for Bharat means building for many, many, many countries. Have you ever traveled from one state to another? If you've ever been on a Euro trip, it feels like a budget version of that, right? You go from one state to another, the language changes, the food changes, the weather changes, the people change. Markets are very different in this country. Building a business in this country, therefore, is not the same as building a business in the US or even in Europe for that matter. We are poorer, we are more diverse, and we have very unique, very different problems. India is the only other country other than China that is home to more than 1 billion people. Put it another way, we're home to 1/5 of all of humanity. Building for Bharat is building for humanity. And therefore, when you start thinking about what kind of businesses matter in this country, I think it's important for you to pause and consider what kind of businesses matter to your people. And your people aren't just those that you grew up with, aren't just those that go to the same office as you or live in the same apartment building as you. Stand at the window, look out, look at the footpaths, look at the small shops, go to a restaurant and look behind the counter. Those are the people you should be building for. Those are the people that will be the future of this country. And it's your responsibility for being privileged enough to watch something like this, to even think about starting up, to serve the needs of those people. And those that actually build businesses that will serve the needs of a rising middle class in India are the ones that will actually build lasting wealth. If you look at India's income pyramid, you'll see there are, even if you cut it by the most broad categories of income, there are at least 3 Indias. There is the India that lives close to poverty or below it. These are people who have a household income of 2 lakh rupees per annum. 2 lakh rupees split 5 ways because it's a household income, remember. That's 40,000 rupees per person per year. That's close to 3,500 rupees per month. What is that? It's barely 100 rupees a day. What that means is there are 630 million people that live like that. As far as I'm concerned, as an investor and as an entrepreneur now, that population earns too little to pay you a meaningful margin. That population is one for whom every rupee counts. And so that population, I believe, is one that is best served by the government and by philanthropic efforts. If you look at the other end of the income pyramid, you'll see about 70 million people that live like us. That's it. 7 crore Indians out of 130. This 7 crore earns more than 10 lakh rupees per annum at the household level, speaks English. We're probably the first ones to get a smartphone. We're definitely the first ones to get data on their smartphones. And therefore, this population behaves quite a bit like any middle income or even higher income country. 70 million people is probably the population of the United Kingdom or France or Germany, which is funny because our standard of living for the top of the pyramid is kind of similar. We live quite well. We often have help, domestic help at home. Again, it bears repeating that we speak English, and that gives us a lead over the rest of the country that is quite unassailable. So when you're talking about building for Bharat, building for your countrymen, what you're really talking about is building for the middle of our Indian income pyramid. These are people, families that earn between 2 and 10 lakh rupees per year. And there are over 50 crore Indians that live like that. And when you think about it, that's not an awful lot of money. Even at the top of that income bracket, we're talking about 10 lakh rupees split between 5 people, which means each person gets roughly about 2 lakh rupees on average to go by for the entire year. That particular category, the one that really worries about where the income tax exemption rate really is, that's middle class. You and I have that level of income, but usually we are, it's just to us. We are sole income earners. We don't have too many dependents. This target audience is probably young, probably aspiring to build something for themselves and for the country. So let's dig a little deeper and see what it takes to build for this, to build for Bharat. What does Bharat look like today? We've spoken a little bit about the diversity, about how many languages we speak, about what our income patterns look like. But when you actually start looking at what has happened to Bharat in the last 5 years or so, you start observing some very interesting trends. The first thing that you start seeing is the fact that the number of mobile phones has increased dramatically. We now have almost as many mobile phones as there are people. We have about 1 billion mobile phone connections. Safe to say that every household probably has one. And in the last 2 years, something very significant has happened, which is the cost of data has dropped by close to 100 times, and the speed of data has gone up by almost 100 times. So video, voice, these things that were just too data expensive, too expensive from a data point of view before, have suddenly become affordable to hundreds of millions of people. We've gone from a smartphone population of under 100 million people, close to 70, 80 million 3 years ago, to now a smartphone population well north of 300 million people. Our internet users count has gone from 150 million 3 years ago to 500 million today. Some people call it the geo effect. Some people call it basically the democratization of data. In the last 4 years, we've opened 350 million bank accounts. Why is that significant? Because bank accounts are the basis of a formal economy. If you don't have a bank account, you can't make a digital payment, you can't accept a digital payment. That change has been significant. In fact, it's been so prolific that in the last 5 years, 1 out of every 2 bank accounts opened anywhere in the world was an Indian bank account. That has laid the foundation for digital transactions, for more formal financing, for basically growth. It's a very foundational step. That, with the number of mobile phone growth or the smartphone growth, along with, of course, the emergence of Aadhaar and it hitting more than 1 billion people, basically means that we now have what is referred to as the Jam Trinity: Jandan, Aadhaar, and mobile, which lays a foundation for most startups and most companies to build a business online to reach millions or even hundreds of millions of Indians cheaply. One of the most important problems facing India's economy today is the lack of formal financing. And so that takes many shapes and forms. We are a poor country because the financial services that are provided by banks or insurance companies or lending companies or mutual funds don't penetrate very deeply in this country. We only have about, we might have about 550 million bank accounts, but really we only have a household debt to GDP ratio of 11%, when the global average is 60%. That doesn't mean India doesn't borrow. It means that we borrow from the wrong places. It means that we borrow from the money lender or from our relatives or from somewhere else where the interest rates are ridiculously high. Merchants usually borrow from their suppliers. Now, these people essentially end up charging rates of interest that are exponentially higher than what an SBI or a bank would charge you, which leads to families entering what we call a vicious debt cycle. If you look at the debt curve of most other countries, it looks like a nice little bell curve, with the debt kind of peaking at age 40, which means when you're at the peak of your earning potential, your debt is the highest. And the debt kind of goes down as you grow older. In India, though, the debt curve looks very different. It's an S curve. What that means is we don't take much debt early on, but as we become family men and women, the number of mouths that we have to feed increases. Therefore, we end up taking a little debt. And as we go later in life, the twin shocks of a wedding and medical emergencies put us well over the top. It leads us to a point where we have taken on so much debt that it passes on to the next generation. Why do we end up with this kind of a debt curve? Why does this happen to Indian families? It's mostly a function of access, which is a function of cost. Right? People aren't able to get the kind of small loan that they want, or they're not able to buy insurance as they should, or they don't invest in the right instruments for a variety of reasons. When you look at investments, 93% of India's household assets are in either real estate or in gold. 85% in real estate, 8% in gold. Only the rest is in financial instruments or in cash or in other things. This has a very important impact because over a 20 or 30 year time frame, real estate and gold give you a 2 to 3% return. Inflation itself over that time period will outstrip the value growth that you would get in real estate or in gold. So people invest in the wrong assets. People don't insure themselves enough. According to the RBI's survey on household finance, 51% of the people surveyed, or 51% of the respondents, believed that insurance was too expensive. To me, that only indicates that most people don't know what insurance is and what it can do for them. And imagine what happens to India's 250 million farmers or farmers and their families when they don't have crop insurance and the rain fails. you result in essentially people take loans and then they have to get them waived. All of these things happen because of lack of access. Lack of access to capital, lack of access to opportunities, lack of access to the right products and services from the right institutions at the right time. Most of this is a function of the fact that because our income levels are so low, even in middle India, you're going to have to shrink the size of the product. You're going to have to make things a lot cheaper and easier to reach if you actually want to serve the masses. One of the most important innovations that has happened to make products and services, at least digital products and services, easier to reach and cheaper to access is what we refer to as the India Stack. The India Stack is a series of layers built on top of Aadhaar that enable paperless, presence-less, cashless transactions. When you are able to do a KYC, a know your customer, electronically instead of doing it through paper, you reduce the cost of KYC from close to 1,000 rupees to maybe around 10 rupees. That's 100 times reduction in your cost of customer acquisition. So when you make it 100 times cheaper to access your service, it suddenly becomes accessible to 100 times larger of an addressable market. I speak about loans because when it comes to a measure of formal finance, one of the measure is household debt to GDP. India's household debt to GDP ratio currently stands at 11.2%. The global average is 60%. Why is that? This is again comes back to the question of the ticket size of the loan. Right? If doing a KYC for an individual costs about 1,000 rupees, and you want that customer acquisition cost to be no more than 1% of your loan size, that means the smallest possible loan you can give someone is 1 lakh rupees, because 1,000 rupees is 1% of 1 lakh rupees. If you make it any smaller, then the cost of customer acquisition becomes larger as a percentage of your loan size, right? And then that messes with your economics. This is very similar to any other business. When you want distribution or marketing limited to a certain portion of your total unit cost, right? So therefore, you can only give a loan of 1 lakh rupees. Now, if you look at that from the context of our GDP per capita, India's GDP per capita is $1,950, or roughly about 1.4 lakhs per annum. If you look at it that way, we're essentially talking about 8 months of income as being the smallest loan that someone can get. If someone wants a smaller loan, for example, if a vegetable vendor wants a 5,000 rupee loan, there's no chance in hell that SBI will give it to them. This means that I have to now go to someone else, whereas SBI would have given me a loan for 10%, 11%, 15%, worst case. I'll have to now go to my local money lender who will charge me 3% a day, which works out to close to 1,000% a year. And that's the cost, that's the price of being poor in this country. When you can't afford something that is formal, the informal option, while it might be available to you, ends up being a lot more expensive. This applies to pretty much any industry. So if you're going to build something for Bharat, remember what Bharat really looks like. Remember how much they can pay. And therefore, when it comes to designing your value chain or your product or your service, be sure to design it in a way and distribute it in a way and market it in a way that makes sense for the income levels and the lifestyles of the middle of income, India's income pyramid. So the first principle in this eightfold path that I'm going to talk to you about for designing for Bharat is sachetization. India is the land of sachets. 90+% of all cigarette sales in India are loose cigarette sales. 90%+ of all shampoo volume that is sold in India in terms of liters is sold in sachets. 90+% of prepaid recharges are for rupees 20 or less. That's because we'd like to pay for a service that we have with the money that we have right now. And most Indians don't have that much money on them at that moment. So sachetization. Think about how do you take your product and shrink it to a small size so that the Aam Aadmi can actually afford it. Right? The second thing to think about is the fact that less than 10% of India is actually salaried, which means less than 10% of India actually has a regular monthly income. Most of India earns very differently. A farmer's cash flow curve, for example, has only two peaks, one during the Kharif season, one during the Rabi season. The rest of it is just expenditure. A carpenter's income curve will look very different. He'll probably get paid whenever he gets some work, right? It's very project based. It's very uneven, lumpy. Vegetable vendor's income curve is daily. So there's a daily drawdown, daily income, and a daily expense. And a casual laborer might get paid weekly. So when you're designing a product and when you're getting someone to pay for something, think about when they earn. So if you're going to structure, for example, a subscription product, should you charge a monthly subscription? It might seem like the default answer because everybody you know earns on a monthly basis. But if you're going to build something for Bharat, think about it for a second. Does subscription even make sense? Do you design a flexible payment plan? How do you do it? That is a function of the people that you want to serve. And their cash flow curves are an important consideration in that service. The third principle to keep in mind when you're designing for Bharat is speed. Speed in and of itself is a feature. It's a feature that matters quite a bit because when you look at what kind of devices your target audience in Bharat would be using, they're not exactly top of the line. Usually entry-level smartphones, probably just entry-level smartphones because it would be the only device that they would have, even to the exclusion of a television. When it comes to an entry-level smartphone, if you're able to optimize your product or your service to work quickly and work well, that in itself gives them reason to use your product. One of the best examples for this, of course, is WhatsApp. Anyone who's used WhatsApp knows that nothing else might be working on your phone, at least from a data standpoint, but that WhatsApp message will somehow find a way to get delivered. That in itself is a reason to keep using that product. It gives that little extra wow and works in a very constrained environment. So that's something that we should all keep in mind while building. The fourth is the fact that memory and data are both very, very precious resources when it comes to a smartphone that is used by your target audience. It's a precious resource because most Indians, when you actually surveyed them, have only about 15 to 17 apps on their phones, and they've downloaded and deleted most other apps several times. So screen real estate and memory real estate is very precious because most of the rest of it is taken up by good morning messages sent by your aunt on WhatsApp. What that means is you're going to have to find a way to make your app or your file size or the JavaScript on your browser for your front-end website as lean and mean and fast as possible. But because remember, a low memory footprint also contributes to speed. A low data consumption product, again, is very, very desirable because if you're building a video product, for example, and you somehow figure out a codec that uses a lot less data, you can be damn sure that people will notice and prefer it because that means less expense for them. So treat it like gold, treat it like a very precious resource. The next principle is, of course, that you've got to be multilingual. In this country, we only have about 100 million people that speak English. So if you are going to be designing a product and you're not going to make it multilingual, I guarantee you it won't reach the masses. Speaking of multilingual, the second most popular YouTube channel in the world is T-Series. Most of our data consumption in this country is on video. Why is that? It's because there's very little written content that is in local languages in India. At the same time, our literacy levels basically mean that we prefer video over text, voice over text. So video and voice, our oral tradition is the next principle that you should be taking into consideration. India is a country where the Mahabharata was actually not written down for a few thousand years after it was first conceived. It was passed on from guru to shishya and so on for generations orally. Our Gurukul tradition, for example, is one that is oral. You sit under a tree and you listen to your guru and you memorize. But the world has changed, right? We are in the digital world. How do you translate that oral tradition into the digital world? Therefore, when you're building for Bharat, if you're building for the consumer, make sure it has a multilingual angle, which also incorporates voice and video, both input and output. And so if you're going to build indexing technologies or if you're going to build search technologies, make sure that it incorporates stuff that is coming in Indian languages. That's because these technologies have not been built by anybody else. Now you would say that Google does have a certain translate feature, a certain multilingual feature, but really the optimization for the vagaries of the Indian market is something that we haven't done. A few startups that have done this well, at least in the social media market, are ShareChat and Vocal. Both have multilingual interfaces that lend themselves very well to voice and video. Another company that recently got acquired by Flipkart, Live.ai, spent a fair amount of time optimizing voice recognition for Indian languages, which made them a valuable company. As the internet in India explodes, taking pride in who we are and our languages and incorporating them into our products and their design is going to become a central theme that creates a lot of value. Ignore that trend at your own peril. The seventh trend that I want to talk about is one that is, India is a do-it-for-me country, not a do-it-yourself country. So this is a country where a middleman plays a very important role. Often when you talk about internet businesses, you talk about disintermediation. And the middleman is viewed as someone that needs to be cut out of the value chain. In India though, where digital literacy is low, where English is the primary language of the Indian internet, having facilitators is a key component of service delivery. And because of this, you see startups like Store King, which has an offline assisted e-commerce model. We have startups like Meesho, which sell on WhatsApp through resellers, through conversations. And those resellers respond to consumers' queries in the local language in real time on WhatsApp. You have startups in the agriculture space that enable distributors to provide credit. So whenever you think of building your product, think of where it sits in that value chain. And if it sits closer to the customer, don't forget that the other layers that come between the supplier and the customer, of the distributor, of the enabler, they have some value in this market. Because the people that you're trying to serve will often require help to buy the product or avail of the service that you're offering. So in your hurry to disintermediate the market, don't fall into the trap of making it hard to access by removing the middleman. We still are a very socially conservative country. This is a country that still suffers from quite a bit of superstition, quite a bit of casteism, quite a bit of racism, quite a bit of traditional beliefs when it comes to how people should marry or how people should live their lives, what people should eat. You see this often even when you're talking about politics. The conversation always goes back to religion, always goes back to values that you and I might not consider liberal values. but judge that at your own peril because they are your customers. And so catering to their needs means catering to their religious beliefs, catering to their culinary preferences, catering to their social behaviors. So while you build a product, make sure that you keep those Indian values at heart. An interesting mnemonic is that was often used during the VAS era, the value added services era of the early 2000s, was what was referred to as the ABCD of what India really wants. A in that stood for astrology. Astrology is something that a lot of Bharat, a large percentage of Bharat, still believes in quite a bit and holds quite dear. So this is a space in which we don't see that many startups kind of building a presence. There are a few exceptions like AstroBuddy, but there's not really been, for example, why hasn't there been an augmented reality based Vastu app? Right? With a compass and your camera, you should be able to point to a particular location and see if the window there is a good thing or a bad thing, right? Why isn't there automated rule-based Kundli matching app for matrimony? This is a feature that Bharat Matrimony should have introduced a long time ago. Do your Kundlis match? Right? When you're looking at this, when you're looking at astrology, always remember that it has a very key role in commerce. There is always a good time to buy something. There is always a good place to do something. Think of it as cues to nudge your users towards a purchase decision. How can you leverage our beliefs that are widely held, for better or for worse, towards increasing your top line? B stands for Bollywood. We are obsessed with our movies and we are obsessed with our celebrities. And again, there haven't been enough digital business models outside of, say, Hotstar or Spool that has actually leveraged our obsession with Bollywood. There is a lot around Shairi or around live chat with video with Bollywood stars or similar kind of business models that can be built that are very uniquely Indian. And if you actually stretch beyond Bollywood to regional cinema, there really hasn't been enough of a push for regional cinema on digital channels because the people running the products for Bollywood are usually Hindi speaking, and therefore the other languages often end up being ignored. So if you speak another mother tongue and if you're familiar with the cinema of your language, then that's something that you can always consider building a business around because there's always going to be demand for it. C, of course, stands for cricket. No surprise there. This is again outside of Hotstar and ESPN and Dream 11 maybe. There hasn't been that much innovation on businesses built around our country's favorite sport. There can be innovations around live commentary, for example. I'm sure you and I both are sick of listening to Ravi Shastri. There can be innovations around, of course, similar to Dream 11, around fantasy leagues, around cricket trivia, around so many areas of the game, around commerce for cricket itself, cricketing supplies. These are aspects that have not again been fully explored. And again, this comes more from the fact that there is a large market that is hungry for more cricket content and more cricket related insights and information than around what particular business model that you would choose to pursue. But it's an area that you can think about. D again, it stood for devotional. God plays an outsized role. We are one of the most religious countries on the planet. How do we build business models around our devotion? One of the first questions I've been asking for a long time is, why isn't there a Zomato for temples? There should be an app that tells you, oh, you're studying for this exam, then go to this temple, because that God has the best blessings for it. Most people do think that way. India does believe that. At the same time, if you want to go for a darshan, this is the best time to go, or this is the prasad that is better in this temple than in that. Same would go for mosques and churches, right? It's not limited to any particular religion. But why doesn't one look at formally monetizing our beliefs more effectively? This is an area that is sensitive, of course, and culturally sensitive. So, if you do choose to pursue a business in this, be sure to respect the sentiments of the people that you're serving. E stands for education. This is a much more challenging space. Unfortunately, I don't have cute and pithy answers or business ideas on education because it's a very serious subject. If you would have seen the employment report that recently came out, means that joblessness is at an all-time high. Often this is because the jobs that exist and the skills that are required to address those jobs don't necessarily meet in the middle. For the next 18 years, we'll have 1 million people turning 18 every single month. Think about that for a second. Where are all these 18-year-olds going to find jobs? How are they going to earn money if they don't have the right education? And education, skilling, and jobs are very, very interlinked. And they will determine the future of our economy. They are a leading indicator. So building products and services that can make us a more educated nation is probably one of the most important things we can do. F stands for finance. If we don't have access to the right loans, to the right insurance, and to the right investment products, a family can never truly be financially secure, and therefore a family cannot truly grow. So building the right micro loan or micro insurance product, or building innovative products so that people are covered, is something that a lot of entrepreneurs will be required to do as our economy grows. Coming to G, and I'll end on this note. G is for government. Government, as far as most of Bharat goes, is Bhagwan. It's what gives them subsidies, gives them roads, electricity, water. Any service that is delivered by the government to this mass of people is a critical service. So enabling more efficient service delivery, be it by increasing the access to information on what government schemes are available that you might be eligible for, or what subsidies you might be eligible for, or even a government job and preparing for that job through an entrance exam. For example, did you know that 4 million people write the bank PO exam every year? 40 lakh people. This is just to get a regular job in a public sector bank. What can you do to make that easier for them? Right. It might be online test prep, it might be something else. How you deliver it? Are you going to deliver it through video? Are you going to deliver it in their local language? Because they can give the test in that language. So when you're building for people from Bharat, put yourself in their place. So while you might call yourself middle class today, I assure you you're not. But at some point, we probably were. If we go back to when we grew up, when the Indian economy was much smaller, when the GDP per capita was much lower, you don't need to look that far. You need to go back only to the early 90s, the period immediately after liberalization. During that time, we had very limited choice, very limited access to devices. We lived a much simpler life, and a lot of us lived in smaller cities, smaller towns. We've all now moved to larger cities. You might be looking at this from a smaller town. A small town life is much closer to what Bharat experiences than what somebody working in an MNC is experiencing today. Somebody in Bangalore, for example, would have a very different experience than what somebody living in Kolar or in Begusarai or in Saurashtra somewhere. Their life is quite different. And when you put yourself in their shoes, or if you're from there, you just think back to what life was like not too long ago. That's what Bharat really lives like. So building for them first means empathizing with their situation. Empathizing with with how they live every single day, understanding their aspiration, enabling that aspiration, understanding their state of finances, and finding a way to deliver that product or service to enable that aspiration while taking into account their financial considerations. Building for Bharat is first and foremost about empathy. If you can just think back to how we used to live, or how a lot of our countrymen live today in less fortunate places, you will begin to get an idea of how one should go about designing for these people. So, when you're talking about sachetization and when you're talking about pricing, you might think of doing it through subscriptions. And when you design a subscription plan, remember that the frequency and the size of that payment both matter quite a bit. So if you are designing a subscription plan for someone with a monthly salary, a monthly subscription makes sense. But if you're designing a subscription service for someone who does not belong to the formal economy and therefore might not have a monthly salary, how should you design that subscription? Should it be all upfront? Should it be a bullet payment whenever that person gets money? Or should it be a very small amount every single day? These are optimizations that you will discover once you find your target audience. All I'm here to say is don't make the mistake of blindly charging a simple monthly subscription if you want to actually serve this market. In one of my favorite books called Little Prince, they say that if you want your crew to build a ship, don't assemble the woodwork and the materials and gather the men and tell them how long they have to build it. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. So, in other words, what you should be doing is learning very well. One of the important skills that you should possess is the ability to sell your vision. Because when you start a company, from hiring to getting customers to raising money, you will have to tell your story again and again and again and again, day in, day out, with the same kind of passion, so that people who you need on that journey with you will have to buy into that vision. That's the only way you can go far. So the ability to get people to buy into your vision is one of the key abilities of a founder. The only way you're going to be able to live a full life and run a company is by exercising a fair amount of discipline. Discipline about where you choose to spend your time. And that's the most important and precious resource you have. So being very selective about how you allocate your time is probably the most crucial aspect of being a successful entrepreneur. Best advice I've been given is that this too shall pass. Whatever it is you're facing, no matter how difficult it is, it'll pass. No matter how on top of the world you are and how successful you are, it will pass. No matter how depressed or elated or how much of a champion you feel, it'll all pass. It's all transient, and therefore live in the moment and live with equanimity as much as possible. The only piece of advice I have for you is don't start up if you want glory or glamour. It's an immense responsibility. The money you raise is not yours, you are a custodian. The people you hire are not yours, you are their custodian, and therefore you are responsible for their income. The customers you serve don't owe you any obligation. In fact, it's the other way around. You owe a responsibility to them to deliver on the promise. So you take on a lot of responsibility when you become an entrepreneur or become a founder. Don't take that responsibility lightly. I've already addressed this in the previous question, but don't treat fundraised money, don't treat funding money as your money. It's not. Don't spend it like it's your money. It's not. Spend it with a lot of responsibility. It's the company's money. I'd first recommend that you read every day. Right? It's not about reading this book or that book. It's about having a habit of reading. My friend used to tell me, or I think it was a Proust quote, Proust quote. I don't know whose quote it is, but they say those who never read a book are doomed to live only one life. Those who read books have the pleasure of living many lives through the eyes of those that read them, that wrote them. So read lots of books, not just one or two, and I'm sure plenty of people will give you recommendations on from the startup aisle of 0 to 1 or hard things about hard things and so on and so forth. They're all good books, but read more than just those books.